So I very quickly threw together a few slides, mostly just to help kind of prompt other conversations. So if there are other folks that want to chime in on any of these, that's great. Or you can all sit silently until the panel discussion, whichever is your choice. And Mike may have, Councilmember O'Brien may have things he wants to chime in with. And then there's the second presentation is on here from Councilmember Rasmussen. So. One of the things that I did while I was on the trip was think, okay, now how do I translate my experience to Seattle? What are some of the similarities and what are some of the differences about the systems that we operate in? And I did go through and do some of the thing about, okay, well, how much money do people have to spend here? How much money do people have to spend in Seattle? And a lot of it is very difficult to compare apples to apples because I did not drill down into how some of these were calculated. But tried to find as consistent a source of information as I could about what does Sweden export? What does the United States export? What does that say about the way the economies are based and the way the job development is based? And some of the things that, relatively speaking, most folks in the U.S. would have more relative income, and yet I think a lot of us would probably note that the U.S. probably has greater income disparity in most states, and sometimes egregiously so in some states, and that we'll talk about that a little bit, gets in the way of some of the policy objectives that we want to get towards. Did a little bit of the same for Denmark, and found not particularly surprising things that machinery and manufacturing are still big imports, both for the U.S. and for these countries. So there's a lot of similarities, and it gets to Richard's point a little bit about where do you start to find differences about how we make policy? Where do we suddenly fall out of alignment where we don't have the same objectives anymore? I have to admit, I knew very little about Stockholm. I majored in Spanish in school. I lived in Spain for a year. I knew very little about Northern Europe, frankly. So it was great for me to be able to be there, and little did I know that Stockholm was actually stretched across 14 islands, and they have more bridges than Seattle does, actually, or more bridges than Portland does. The land area was interesting. We often think of Seattle as being very spread out, and that stands in our way of being able to be bold and to make really aggressive transportation policy decisions and housing decisions. We are not that much more spread out than Stockholm. We are more spread out than Copenhagen. Copenhagen, of course, is particularly flat. But we do have just such a much smaller bicycle mode share, and most of us would say it's because of topography and weather, but it's not like we have, frankly, worse, more uncomfortable weather than Northern European cities. And there are some things about the way I certainly look at the weather and think, oh my God, it's windy and cold. I can't bike home. Good Lord. But it was great to see that in Copenhagen, the number of people who that is the regular mode of transportation. It was also good to hear them say that it has taken 30 years to get there, and that this change did not happen overnight, that it happened progressively through a number of steps. But to think about having 30 years of a consistent commitment to a particular policy direction, that's kind of overwhelming for us to think about. We can't hold it in place for 4 years, And that kind of commitment to a particular policy directive over that length of time, and to have the alignment between the national government, the regional government, and the municipal government is mind-boggling for us. And that gets in our way sometimes, and it shouldn't. We should be able to change that. Some of the things I would think of, and as we were going around, is that to some degree the Seattle land area does present a challenge for us because of the topography compared to the visits to Stockholm and Malmo and Copenhagen. But it's not insurmountable if we're able to align our investments with our infrastructure and where our density is supposed to be. We are a Western U.S. city. We look like a city that grew up around the car. It's the way we act, and it is the way we still look. The job-based diversity for us, I think when we were in Stockholm in particular and looked at the areas that were being redeveloped that were former port areas, we still have a working port, and there's certainly debate about how many more decades we will have a working port. But we have a job-based diversity that I think we are still trying to hang on to, and that presents some challenges that I think we would like to look for models and look for ways to figure out how other cities have been successful doing that. And we do seize on the idea that the green economy can be one way to do that we can have an industrial economy that serves our values about the environment as well as our values about living wages and benefits. The U.S. and the way that wealth disparity manifests itself in the U.S. was really interesting to think about in terms of what does homelessness look like in Copenhagen, what does homelessness look like in Stockholm. And given that this trip partially focused on opportunities and challenges that Seattle Housing Authority has around Yesler Terrace, it was challenging to think about. So how do we shape our system to better eradicate homelessness, however we want to phrase that, better provide for housing for all, and the different models. There is a group actually coming from Copenhagen next month to talk about how Seattle deals with homelessness in terms of single individuals versus families, and that part, I think it would be interesting to incorporate that into a tour in the future to talk a little bit about how the economy is better, or how income disparity is better addressed, and how to have there be some dialogue about that here. One of the challenges for Seattle is that we have an incredibly diversified planning and planning world in terms of what Marshall Shop does, what the Puget Sound Regional Council does, what the state of Washington does, what the Growth Management Act mandates, what the Growth Management Hearings Board does, and we control many things that happen inside our borders, but we do it with some fairly blunt instruments in terms of zoning. And also our control of transit, being able to support what we want to do with the infrastructure when we learn these lessons. In order to have there be a great bike system, there does have to be a complete system that meets people's needs. And I think we can continue to do a lot of the things that we've learned about with bikes, and we have to also find the other things that work for the folks who will not be on the bikes for some reason. Bike infrastructure was great, though. I mean, it really is amazing to go and be able to actually see how many little things are thought of. And so just the little ways to make sure that you don't even have to pick up your bicycle in order to take it up 2 stairs. And I think of all the times in college that I lugged my bicycle up, 2 flights of stairs. And also from the subway, in order to push baby strollers up, and bicycles as well. The infrastructure was so complete. With a lot of things, certainly that we saw in terms of changing norms about housing, and what does it mean to have a denser community and people living in closer proximity. So we saw a lot of great images of what it means to have attractive urban living. And some of the challenges for us are that we certainly get a lot of questions about, so where are the schools going to be? Where will the grocery stores be? Seattle has a jobs housing imbalance. Far more people come into the city to work than actually live in the city. And that is a challenge for our transportation system. The bike tour was great, and then walking around in Malmo was great. And I think one of the things that we took away was that what you needed to do was have a great big area where we could have a housing expo. And the housing expo draws everybody in, and you give them a little piece of property, and you say, build some great housing, and then you get to keep that afterwards, which was brilliant. I don't know why we haven't thought about that before. We've talked a little bit about district energy, and I think we'll talk about it more as a great opportunity in Seattle. And there's some economics about it that are kind of interesting. District heating is a great opportunity for Seattle Housing Authority, but there's some economics about it. About does it make sense for people to invest in that, given how cheap some of the alternatives are for people here, and that we don't have a great federal subsidy investment in energy right now. Some people are excited about it, and some are not. That was my list of slides. I wanted to hand it over to Councilmember